Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. I'm mostly going to read, but I brought a lot of images so that we can discuss throughout my presentation. What I'm going to present today is based on two research projects. One project on history and history teaching in Portugal, analyzing compulsory schooling history textbooks, which finished 4 years ago, but which I still continue to do research on, and we just published a book in Portuguese now, a Portuguese translation of that research last week. And another project, which is a European project on racism and anti-racism in Europe, which was coordinated at the Center for Social Studies by Boaventura de Sousa Santos and Silvia Meazo. And I'm going to draw as well on that research and my previous research experience, especially on questions of racism in education. So Portugal had the longest process, and I'm trying to address here an international audience, and so I decided today not to go so much into detail into my analysis, but to bring you a broad overview of my research onto colonialism and anti-colonialism. So for those of you who do not know the history of Portugal, Portugal had the longest process of colonialism in Europe and was the last country to grant independencies to its former colonies, something which happened only after a bloody so-called colonial war in 3 fronts, in Angola, Mozambique and Guinea, and that lasted over 13 years, and a coup d'etat by the armed forces in Portugal in April 1974, which restored democracy after nearly 5 decades of dictatorship by Salazar's new state regime. In this communication, I will focus on contemporary processes of institutional and social forgetting of colonialism and anti-colonialism as well in Portugal, and which I think are crucial to understand current institutionalized racism, anti-racist struggles, and the contemporary obstacles that these are facing. I would like to highlight 2 key theoretical works that have been crucial to this research. First, work by Kwame Nimako and Stephen Small, who have addressed questions regarding the social and institutional forgetting of Atlantic enslavement, focusing on public history and collective memory in European contexts as well as the United States. Their analysis of the current memorialization of enslavement reveals the highly racialized nature of social remembering and social forgetting, as well as the segregation in knowledge production and dissemination at the heart of such processes. The collective remembering of slavery, they argue, is carried out as a consequence of the political struggles by racialized populations, and is particularly visible at community level, having mostly emerged as a reaction to the social forgetting going on at national level, both socially and institutionally. A second key work that I would like to bring, and I would like to highlight here, is that of Michel Fauve-Trouillot, Silencing the Past, published in 1995, which is crucial to understand the production of silences in history and historiography around colonialism and enslavement, and he uses the revolution of IT as a case in point. Trouillot sees these silences as having been established more broadly, and I read, an overall sketch of world historical production through time suggests that professional historians alone do not set a narrative framework into which their histories fit. Most often, someone else has already entered the scene and set the cycles of silence. This highlights the key importance of wider political, economic, cultural, and social factors in the production of historical knowledge. Since Trouillot's book was first published in 1995, we certainly came a long way, haven't we? Surely, the previously forgotten revolution of the IT, the first independent nation resulting from a slave revolt and taking place in the end of the 18th century, beginning of 19th, now features not only in historiographical accounts, but also in the textbooks of contexts such as the United Kingdom. The images displayed in the slide are from the textbooks of the School History Project in the United Kingdom, and it should be mentioned that their textbooks are not so often used. So, I mean, there will be an exception to class resources. As this next image reveals, IT is also the context chosen, along with Arab countries, to illustrate modern slavery, a problematic concept which has tended to be deployed to downplay the role of Atlantic enslavement in nation formation and overdevelopment in Europe. So you sort of acknowledge the slave-resistant processes that were taking place in IT, just to say in the next page that, you know, look, where can we find modern slavery nowadays? In IT. So they already brought it to themselves. So this kind of ontological idea that some people are more apt for enslaving others. So, for instance, there's absolutely no mention to this idea of modern slavery in the Western world. Let us now turn, what I wanted to highlight here is the operation of these formulas of silence which allow for the inclusion of content. You see the content on the revolution of the IT and processes of resistance, which for instance in the Portuguese case did not feature, but you have the inclusion of this new information, so-called new, without a change in the master Eurocentric approach that pervades the whole books, and this is what I'm going to address here. So let us now turn to the Portuguese context to analyze in detail the operation of such formulas of silence around colonialism. There was some problem formatting here, but so this is a statute against forgetfulness. On June 10th, 1971, the day, at the time it was called the Day of the Race in the new state dictatorship in Portugal, the City Council of Coimbra, where I come from, inaugurated the Square to the Overseas Heroes, a designation that endures and which includes this bronze statue that honors the Portuguese soldiers who were then fighting in the overseas colonial war against the national liberation fighters in Africa. The statue represents a uniformed soldier walking with a gun in his right arm, while with the left he holds a black child that he carries on his shoulders, a bit embodying the white man's burden kind of idea. With the construction of a shopping mall, a football stadium for the Euro 2004 and a sports complex, the square was reduced in size, but the statue was maintained and officially re-inaugurated in 2005. At that time, when Portugal had just celebrated the 31st anniversary of the Revolution of '74, which restored democracy, the newspaper Público, a high-profile national daily broadsheet, celebrated the event with the title A Statue Against Forgetfulness. Criticism of the monument circulated, and of the inauguration, including by the well-known specialist in the history of the new state, Fernando Rosas, in the same newspaper. Rosas denounced the colonial revival fueling the initiative. In his view, the monument was a gesture of apology and legitimacy of the colonial war, promoted by 3 years of right-wing governments, and I quote, "The heroism of the war and of the combatants, the recovery of colonialism and colonial war as key moments in the historical continuity with the past of the discoveries in the Portuguese expansion, the condoning of Salazarism as mongering the homeland defense war, the undisguised glorification of the empire, all were openly recurring themes of the passage of the extreme right through power, with the active support, it should be noted, of the commands of the armed forces who staged the coup d'etat, who have always been actively associated with this kind of discourse and its related events." At the time, Rosas constructed the debate as a matter of right versus left politics. The examples I bring here today, taking place under left-wing and right-wing governments, illustrate that the memorialization of colonialism and anti-colonialism and the silences that shape them surpasses the narrow confines of party politics. So let us go back to Trujillo, and from his analysis of the treatment of the Haitian Revolution in written history outside the IT, Trujillo reveals two families of tropes, both constituting formulas of silence. So he distinguishes formulas of erasure, which are formulas that tend to erase directly the fact of a revolution, such as the revolution of the IT or resistance by the enslaved. And this kind characterizes mainly the generalists and the popularizers, textbook authors, for example. And then it talks about formulas of banalization or trivialization, which tend to empty a number of singular events of their revolutionary content, so that the entire string of facts, none for all sides, becomes trivialized. These are the favorite tropes of the specialists of the times, overseers and administrators in Saint-Domingue or politicians in Paris. Whilst I think it's very useful analytically to understand how these formulas accommodate critical voices, I argue that this distinction is becoming more blurred as social mobilization also promotes a readjustment of hegemonic narratives on history. So let us now examine an example of erasure. And this is from Portuguese history textbooks. The painting Dance of Black People by Flemish artist Zacharias Wagner, who lived in the 17th century and was also a soldier in Dutch Brazil, is seen as attesting for the presence of religious and cultural expressions of black people in Brazil at the time. The figure is included in history textbooks with the subtitle Black Slaves Dancing on a Holiday. Nothing is said about the struggles led by the enslaved or about the Maroon communities they formed at that time in history, namely the Maroon of Palmares, Quilombo de Palmares. Rather, the inclusion of such images contributes to the idea that the enslaved were treated with some dignity and could even enjoy some free time. Violence, if at all featuring in textbooks, is implicitly portrayed as resulting from abuses in the system of enslavement and increasingly interpreted in the framework of individual human rights, so as a violation of the rights of individuals. This is framed within the wider context of national narratives on Portuguese colonialism as soft, benevolent, and characterized by intercultural relations, a key message in the work of official institutions in Portugal. Further, this is sustained by the absence of engagement with racism. Except for one of the textbooks we analyzed, there is no indication of the racist Portuguese colonial policies put in place during the 20th century, with racism being only mentioned in relation to the British, French, and Belgian cases. So what we can see is a wider cycle of silences around colonialism, which dismisses the violence of this history, as well as the relevance of processes of resistance, such as national liberation struggles. Also, except for one of the textbooks we analyzed, there is no indication of the racist colonial policies. This approach is framed within the wider context of narrating Portuguese colonialism as soft, and which we can see here embodied in this work published by the High Commissioner for, it was called like that before, High Commissioner for Immigration and Cultural Dialogue, now it was renamed as High Commissioner for Migration. And in this book, for instance, and in this collection that was launched, Intercultural Portugal, it states at a certain time, intercultural phenomena were born in the most unlikely situations and places, and times inhospitable to their formation. See, for example, slavery, mother of many of the intercultural societies in the Americas, which we see as a clear example of the depoliticization of history. This is not an isolated case. Rather, it has been the preferred approach by policy and decision makers. As you can see in the excerpt on the suggestion of the persistence of racism in Portugal, after a visit to the country by the UN Committee of Experts in the International Year of Afro-Descendants in 2011, that colonial history, supposedly characterized by intercultural relations, is constantly deployed by the Portuguese state as a means of indefinitely postponing the discussion on racism. While in the previous slide we could see the operation of formulas of erasure, deleting colonial violence and resistance by the enslaved, here we can see how critiques are neutralized by formulas of banalization or trivialization deployed to narrate the national liberation movements in Africa, especially in the 60s and the 70s. In this case, it is not that independence struggles are totally erased, but that their significance is constricted in such a way that actually contributes to their understanding as devoid of a political program, as murderers in nature, and these kind of images that you see on the left are very striking, and as having absolutely no positive impact on the metropolitan context, and namely of having absolutely no contribution to the restoring of democracy. This is achieved along the victimization of the white Portuguese in the African colonies, particularly through the use of images showing the dead or injured soldiers and the hopelessness of families of colonial settlers who had to return to the mother country following African independences. The humanity of those fighting for independence or the contribution of freedom fighters to restore democracy is thus erased. As I mentioned earlier, there have been some efforts to add new content. Allowing for multi-perspectivity, a methodology fostered by the Council of Europe aiming at confronting different and conflicting views of a single historical event. And yet no significant change has been achieved. The current selection and arrangement of information, and I brought like a full page here of a textbook in which you have included, and this is a very common narrative formula in Portuguese textbooks now, you contrast the perspective by Salazar, the dictator, with the perspective by Amílcar Cabral, one of the leading figures in the national liberation struggles. And so you have two positions in contradistinction, whilst you have a sort of an arrangement which legitimates a specific perspective. So when you look in the top, you see the pictures always portraying the white soldiers as victims of black violence. When you look on the left, the graph is counting the kind of economic losses that the war caused in metropolitan Portugal. So there's no accounting of the death or the losses in the colonial side. And then the exercises that are proposed below ask students to engage with someone who fought in the war, always sort of presupposing that he's white, okay? So even though there is a multiplicity of perspectives, formally, actually we think that, they're not competing on an equal ground. So what I'm arguing for is that we need more than just this empty plurality of perspectives approach. We need a change in the national narratives, which has been a key demand by grassroots collectives here in Lisbon. And I brought one, well, the picture is gone, okay. And I brought an excerpt from a text by Plataforma Gueto, which is a collective here in Lisbon. And they wrote this text in reaction to the celebrations of the 25th of April, and this text is illustrative of the demand for the reconsideration of the African subject in history and in contemporary politics. And I read, the 25th of April, so we're referring to the 1974 revolution, is a noble date, sorry, this plane is a bit noisy. So the 1974 revolution is a noble date in the history of Portugal, in universal history, and particularly in contemporary history. But to think that this event represented a milestone established only by the Portuguese armed forces ultimately reduces the importance of such an event. In this sense, we propose here a broader reading of the possible causes of this historic event. Thus, we thoroughly reject the idea that the 25th of April embodied a mere military revolt or expression of discontent by the military. This perspective makes it a social epiphenomenon circumscribed in a specific historical time. Africans did not need the 25th of April to free themselves from the colonial yoke of imperialist and capitalist exploitation imposed under the auspices of Portuguese colonialism. Guinea-Bissau, for example, had unilaterally declared within the United Nations General Assembly, sorry, I skipped a line, had unilaterally declared independence in 1973, a year before the revolution, and this was recognized immediately within the United Nations General Assembly by about 80 countries. We do not accept a reductionist vision of such a phenomenon that seeks to whitewash the facts and disregards the liberation movements. And yet, this is not just an intellectual matter. These struggles are much about representation as about access to power and resources in housing, education, healthcare, and against racist police violence. While the challenge in education is crucial, what is at stake is a much wider scenario of historically constituted unequal relations based on race, which impacts on education at all levels, and as Christina will address, in spatial segregation, in processes of academic selection, in teacher expectations, in the curricula and canons of knowledge, in disciplinary surveillance and punishment, and so on. And so I end with the quote by Amilcar Cabral: always bear in mind that the people are not fighting for ideas, for the things in anyone's head. They are fighting to win material benefits, to live better and in peace, to see their lives go forward, to guarantee the future of our children. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the invitation of the EDITE group, and I bring a presentation about the Afro-descendants in the Portuguese educational system. I will talk about some of the statistics, official statistics that say a lot about the situation of Afro-descendants in the educational system. This work, it's not a final product of a research. It's an ongoing research that it didn't start just with my PhD, but in some way, yes, but with other researchers and projects that I have been with other teams, with other people. So I'm always trying to accumulate more and more knowledge, and spaces like these, discussing these results, and can always bring new ideas for this work. One part that has been very interesting in this work has to be with some different spaces where I've been discussing these results out of academia, and trying really to address Afro-descendant public, because it's very hard to do it and to find them in Portugal. So like today, I think we are three. We are three. So it's an effort that gives me a lot of pleasure, and that really brings new ideas for for the research, but also for what does it mean to make science, to have all this knowledge, and for what is the use of all this. In Portugal, we don't gather information about ethno-racial origin. In some places in the world, yes, but not in Portugal. It's considered a sensitive question, like religion. But actually, we gather information about religion in a census. So I think there is a space for us to discuss how could we try to have this kind of information. Because when we don't have it, there's a lot of things we are missing in this picture, and the data that I bring show just a small part of this reality, but I think it shows a lot. I bring you different data from different sources for what we can have. So I have statistics from the Ministry of Education, national statistics from census, and other from Observatory of Secondary Students of School Pathways. In each source, the way we can approach Afro-descendant students, it's different. In some you just have the citizen status. In other places you have the place of birth. And in other places you have the place of birth of the student and the place of birth of the parents. So this is a puzzle that I bring you. Sometimes I'm using one, sometimes I'm using the other. But none of them it's really accurate to what we want to study. And more and more it will not be accurate because we have children that are Afro-descendants that are born in Portugal, and their parents are born in Portugal too. And this is a reality that will be more and more often. Some of the biases that we can find in this data, like I said, we don't have direct information about ethno-racial origin, so we go by proxies. We know that these big surveys institutionalized by the state, have some problems in gathering information with the populations and in territories that feel that they are categorized like irregular or illegal or something like that. And there is another issue, and Marta also talked about that. In Portugal, we have this huge population that was living, it's 500,000, that came in the 70s from Africa, from the ex-colonies, and a part of them were born in Africa, in Angola and Mozambique. And they come, in the statistics, they are counted as Afro-descendants. And this is a problem that we have, and we find it, and you will see, I will show you an example, that Afro-descendants from Angola, with Angolan origin, will have very different pathways in the educational systems, in statistical terms. And I think that it's because we are mixing all these different populations. How many, we don't know how many Afro-descendants we have in Portugal. So maybe we should ask how many are invisible. But we can try with this different data that we have to make some considerations about that. We know by citizen status from PALO, Portuguese-speaking African countries, we know that in the global population in Portugal they represent like 1%. In Lisbon, like 3%. But if we try to go at Lisbon and just in the youth population till 34, we have like 4%. If we use the other indicator, the place of birth, you see these numbers will actually are actually higher, like 3% in the global population, 8% in Lisbon, and 5% in the youth population. Other work from Teresa Seabra, I've been involved in some of that too, used data from the Ministry of Education, where we have the 3 places of birth of mother, father, and the student, and we made a combination of the places of birth, trying to to address Afro-descendant students. And what we could see is that in 4th grade, you have like almost 40% of the population in Lisbon is from Afro-descendant origin. And of course, we are not counting the ones that are Afro-descendant but were born in Portugal and their parents too. So it's an important population in Lisbon. We don't know about these Afro-descendants that were born here and their parents too, but we don't know also nothing about Afro-Brazilians, for instance, and black people that come to Portugal from different places in the world. But that face some of the same problems that the Afro-descendants that we can find in the statistics. To give you an idea of the territorial distribution, you can see by municipality that the Afro-descendant population, and here I'm using the place of birth, I'm always changing, I will always talk about that. The place of birth, using that indicator, you can see that they are in the periphery of Lisbon. In the Sintra, Amadora, in Amadora they are like 12%, and I'm just talking about the place of birth, not using that great indicator that uses the 3 places of birth. And if we go by parish, freguesia, you can see that in Val da Moreira they are like 36%, and I'm just using the place of birth. In Apelação, 23%. So there's a lot to make visible about these issues. We don't actually have data that can tell us specifically where they are, but we know by a lot of research that exists that many of the Afro-descendants live in neighborhoods that are very marginalized. And these, if we see the other slide of the parishes and we see this one with the neighborhoods that are considered prioritary for intervention, you can see that there's some overlap. We have to make more work in this about this, but we can see this segregation, this urban segregation going on without having signs about where the black people should live or white people should live, but it actually happens. Going to data about education. Here's a graphic from a work of Teresa Seabra, where I've been also involved, and what we could see, and here we have the ethno-racial origin, using like the 3 places of birth, and what we can see, there's some inequality in access to education, but especially in higher education, you can see they have half the chance to be in university or in the higher education system, with youth from 18 to 34 years old. So it's a big. Of course, Portugal doesn't have like this big access to higher education, comparing it to other countries in Europe. But this gap, it's really striking. Grade repetition rates. In Portugal, this is a phenomenon that happens a lot, not just to Afro-descendant, but to white pupils too. But it actually in the first, I call it, ISHSED 1, like primary school, it happens 3 times more for the children that have nationality or citizenship status from Portuguese-speaking African countries, and we all know, and there are a lot of political orientations in the sense that in the first years there should not be grade repetition, because it marks a lot the relationship of the children with the school, but also from the school with the children, because there are records that go with the children wherever it goes. And it brings more processes of segregation, progressive segregation, in their pathway. From the 5th grade to the 6th grade, you have 2 times more grade repetition, and this goes along till upper secondary education. We always have this big gap. And if you think here in upper secondary education, it's not just 2 times more, it's half of them face grade repetition. So something is really blocking their pathways in school. I brought this graphic too, just to for us, maybe we can discuss this in the end. Why does Portugal and other countries, but not others, have such high grade repetition rates? In Portugal, this is a very regular instrument of sanction of the students. But in other places, in other countries, this is not used. It's an exceptional instrument, and we need to talk about this. Enrollment rates in vocational tracks. In 7th grade till 9th grade, they have like 13 years old, 14, 15. 22% of the children with African citizenship are in vocational tracks. And we know that there are political orientations in that sense, that we should delay the maximum we can this moment of differentiation, of tracking. And what happens is that it's not exceptional for them. It's like 22%. For the Portuguese are like 7%. And we are talking about 3 times more. And in the secondary education, upper secondary, they are 2 times more in these tracks. But if you see the number 78, it means that almost all of them in upper secondary education go to these vocational tracks. If we think in the grade repetition, you see that 50% were facing grade repetition in secondary education. So, and in the general tracks, the academic tracks. So the ones they are not going for the academic tracks, the 80% are in vocational. So going in one way or the other, you are facing obstacles. This is a graphic that shows, it's not about Afro descendants in specifics, but it shows what happens to the students that were in academic tracks and professional tracks 1 year after the diplomation of upper secondary. And they are having very different lives after 1 year of diplomation, of graduation. 79%, 80% of the students that were in academic tracks, they followed to university, to higher education, almost all of them. In professional tracks, just 6% of them. So if we think that 80% of the Afro-descendants, in the way that we could, operationalize it in a statistic way, they have their access blocked to higher education. And we can see this here in this data. If we see all the PALOP citizenship, here we are talking always about, no, he is not citizenship, I'm sorry. It's ethno-racial origin, so it's the one that has the three places of birth. We see that all of them have 2 times less opportunity to access to higher education. But if we see only the Cape Verdean, Guinean, and Santominian, and this is about the retornados that I talked in the beginning, you see that is 5 times less their access to higher education. So I think this has a lot to do with tracking, with vocational tracks, and with urban segregation too, because schools that are in these territories tend to have more vocational tracks and to do it more often, and so there's not the need to ask them if they want to go to higher education or not. They are just blocked in the 10th grade. A question that many times people do when I do this presentation, it's about social class. I say, no, but this is an issue of social class, because we know that African descendants come from families that are, poor, that have professions with low qualifications, and they haven't studied so much like the Portuguese population. So one exercise that I've done with the data that I could gather was to try to see if for the same social class, for the same cultural capital background of the family, if there were inequalities, if the inequalities would persist or not. And what we can see, and I've done this with this data and data from other years, and it's always the same reality. Actually, inequality reduces, but it doesn't disappear, and it goes always in the same direction. Afro-descendants, even when they are from higher classes, social class, they face more enrollment in vocational tracks or more grade repetition. So it's always there. Class is important, of course, but there is this other part that we need to address, and that has to do with institutional racism. Not considering it as a discrimination from one-to-one in interaction, but thinking it as a structural force and phenomenon that has to do with the relations of power relations, and not just with this interpersonal discrimination. In the same way that we think about exploitation in capitalism, we never think that there is a bad employee, a patronage, that it's discriminating the employees. When we think about paternalism, or we don't think that it's a man that it's bad and it's being bad to a woman. It's a structural phenomenon, and we need more and more to discuss it and to address it as it is. So I bring some questions in case we need it, and one has to do with this: how can we go from a debate in racism, about racism, that it's not just interpersonal discrimination, and we go further and try to address it as a structural phenomenon, as an institutional phenomenon that operates beyond the intentions of the people in presence. How can we collect data about ethno-racial origin in Portugal? Because if we don't collect it, if we don't collect this, we'll not know. In this moment, we know that in Portugal there are classes there are and schools that are only constituted by Roman children, and we don't have ways to have access to information about that. I was discussing this the other day in Edite, even with people that had to do with education policy, and you were there too. And they said, no, we don't need to know it because the Ministry of Education knows it. But the public needs to know. But the Roman groups need to know, to use that information too. Third question, what kind of desegregation in school spaces and curricular tracking do we want? Is it possible to differentiate without stratifying? Can we do that? Is it possible to desegregate school without desegregating the urban territory? Because schools and territory are very connected. Some of the segregation that we find in schools have a lot to do with this territorial effect. Should we, and this is a hard question, should we close some of the ghetto schools that we know that really are segregating, that really are places of massive marginalization? Should we close them, or are we taking out from territories that are already marginalized? Are we taking the last resource, the last institutional resource in those territories? How to build a non-Eurocentric curriculum? That's other question, and Marta has addressed this by the history books, but there's a lot of other ways in which this Eurocentric view goes through school. What kind of anti-racist approach in teachers' training? Will we still talk about this kind of interpersonal discrimination, being tolerant, or should we change this to another way of viewing anti-racist policy? What policies of direct promotion of ethnic and racial equality in access to higher education? We are talking about quotas. We have space to talk about that in Portugal or not. And for the list, the seventh, what policy of representation of Afro-descendants in the fields of production and reproduction of knowledge, as teachers, as scientific researchers? And that's all. Thank you.